I want to do a follow-up video today to one I did a few days ago, where I talked about Myers-Briggs and law school admissions. And I focused that last video on the intuitive judgers, in large part because they're so overrepresented in elite law schools. But I received a number of requests to do a follow-up video on the NPs, the intuitive perceivers, and particularly the NTPs, the intuitive thinker perceivers. Now, the reason why I had largely skipped over them in my last video was because they are relatively underrepresented in elite law school admissions. So, for example, NPs, intuitive perceivers, generally are somewhere around 20% of the population. In that, at Yale Law School, at least according to one informal survey, the NPs comprised about 14% of the Yale Law School class. And I think that there's probably a degree of underreporting here. And I think that's true because I found, and a lot of other people have commented in the Myers-Briggs community, that NTPs, but I think in particular the INTP personality types, tend to be somewhat skeptical about Myers-Briggs and generally are critical of it. So that may have affected participation in the survey. But my hunch is that probably, even accounting for underreporting and all that, you probably at elite law schools have the NP personality type roughly congruent with the overall percentage in the population. Now, okay, so the question I want to dig into is why are intuitive perceivers not, maybe below what they ought to be, or what you might expect them to be in elite law schools, and I think there are a couple of things going on here. So first of all, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, I don't think that for the most part, intuitive perceivers are absent in elite law schools because they don't want to be there. I think of the intuitive perceivers, I would say there's only one type, the INFPs, who are just obviously not a good fit for law schools. The INFP personality is very quiet. They feel very deeply. They tend to be found largely in caretaking kind of professions. They're predominantly women. INFPs are actually the most likely to be stay-at-home parents, and it just makes sense that they wouldn't necessarily even want to go to law school. They're probably not as comfortable with the kind of confrontation and the debate that's apparent in law schools. But I do think that the other three types of NPs, the INTPs, the ENTPs, and the ENFPs, all have a certain temperament or skill set that could conceivably work and really thrive in a law school setting. And so the question is, so why aren't they here? And I have a couple theories on why that is, and then I want to talk about what can be done about that and offer some concrete practical advice for intuitive perceivers who do want to go to an elite law school. So I think the number one reason is that the elite law school admissions process is not a filter that happens in isolation. It's largely reflective of what happens in the undergraduate admissions process. And I talked in the last video about how the K-12 system in formal schooling generally, but especially in the public school system, is very much shaped and designed by the censor judges. And I think in particular, at the practical line level, really it's from the SFJs, the censor feeler judges, who tend to make up a disproportionate number of teachers throughout the K-12 process. Now, I think it's fair to say that that both the NPs and the NJs, and especially the NTPs and the NTJs have a certain, to put it mildly, a disconnect with SFJs. And I think this in particular manifests in the K through 12 level, where you'll have like an SFJ female teacher who just cannot really understand or relate to a male NJ personality, intuitive judger. And the where this sort of tends to manifest is basically that the male NJs, especially at that age, will be regarded as being troublemakers or disobedient or backtalkers, that kind of thing. But I think that the way this conflict ends up unfolding between like an SFJ teacher and an NJ student versus an NP student can be quite different. So with the NJs, one of the things about them is that they tend to be very goal-oriented and very driven, and they're very strong-willed. And so what you might find with like an NTJ, for example, who's very overrepresented in a top law school, is that they might sit in the back of a classroom while their SFJ teacher is droning on, and they might be kind of sitting back there sulking and just reeking with utter contempt. But because they're goal-oriented, because they know they want to get into a certain college or whatever, they figure out a strategy and they figure out a way to navigate the process. And then because they have this judger side, they know how to meet deadlines. They just have the organizational skills and so forth to get through this process. And then when they get to the college level, for reasons I talk about in the last video, they really thrive and they end up doing well in the process. With the NPs, it's really tough because, first of all, the NTP personality or the NFP personality, their temperament and their natural inclination and learning styles are just totally diametrically at odds with how the K through 12 system is organized. So like some of the kind of common issues that NPs tend to have in the school system is that they tend to be known as the chronic underachievers. These are the kids who are just very bright, very capable, often very intellectual and curious, but they just end up, their intelligence does not tend to manifest in high grades. On the other hand, they require a great deal of intellectual stimulation that more formal rote instruction cannot provide. But that understimulation and boredom, unlike the NJ who might deal with it and then find things to do elsewhere, the NPs just end up lagging. NPs cannot really do rote memorization. And then you combine that with the fact that often they tend to be, especially at that age when they're a little bit less mature, they tend not always to be able to manage socially in schools. I mean, I don't know this for sure. I'm speculating here, but my strong suspicion would be that if you look at this epidemic of ADD and ADHD prescriptions, and now I mean they're prescribing all kinds of drugs and whatnot for these behavioral disorders. I mean, I think it's pretty well established that these things are overprescribed generally, but I'd be willing to bet that if you look at rates of overprescription, they're probably in particular impacting the NTP personality types. And I would be willing to bet that INTP and ENTP males in particular are just being overprescribed with ADD, ADHD medication just because authority figures don't really understand or are responsive to how their brain works. And so what I think happens with the NPs, so they're now put in these K through 12 schools where they're almost set up to fail. And then I think what is often very tragic is that you see, I've noticed in particular in upper middle class or upper class families where you have one or sometimes two parents who are very who are judges, and they tend to be successful as professionals who made it through this formal school system. Like they might have a perceiver child, or maybe like two kids, one of whom is a judge or the other is a perceiver. And because they can't really relate to the perceiver mind, they may almost like put them down. Like they might say, "Oh, the perceiver, why are you so lazy? Why are you disorganized? Why can't you get things done?" And then when you have like one kid who's a judger and one a perceiver, especially if the older one is a judger, that especially can invite unflattering stereotypes, almost like those old. I don't know if you guys are familiar, those old Goofus and Gallant cartoons, where it might be like, Goofus, the perceiver, why are you always behind schedule? Why aren't you doing well in school? Your brother Gallant is so organized. He's the president of the class, etc. No, it's nonsense, of course. I mean, I don't think there's any evidence that any of the personality types have a higher or lower IQ or capacity to learn or contribute. And in fact, I even think that the NTPs are often much more intellectual for reasons I can talk about. But it just doesn't always manifest. And so now what ends up happening is that, these NJs tend to do better in the college admissions process. And then, so now, if you're not entering into a top undergraduate school, you're already at a pretty severe disadvantage by the time you get into the elite law school admissions game. And that's to say nothing of just all the negative programming and feedback that the intuitive perceivers have gotten their whole life about their capacity to succeed in school. So I think this filtering issue is one reason why you see a discrepancy here. But then, even when you account for that distorting effect, I mean, obviously at any top school, you're going to have a decent percentage of intuitive perceivers, especially because they're so intellectual. So then the question becomes, well, why don't they perform a certain way in college or beyond in a way that allows them to get into a top tier law school? And I recorded another video on this concept, and I'll link it. It gets into more detail. But the way that I would think about it is that in the elite law school game, there's sort of a macro strategy that you have to get right, and then a micro strategy, both of which tend to favor judgers over perceivers. So at the macro level, what you find is that NJs, intuitive judgers, tend to plan on a very long-term time horizon, and they're comfortable making decisions. And so it's not in the least bit unusual that you'll meet an intuitive judger at a top law school, and then you'll ask them, well, when did you decide to go to law school, or when did you decide that you want to be a lawyer? And they'll say, just with a total straight face, that they decided sometime when they were like 7 years old or 8 years old. And they'll say this as if it's perfectly normal, because that's how their brain works. I'm an INTJ. I decided that I wanted to work in politics and policy around age 4 or 5. And then I had decided in the middle of high school that I wanted not only to go to a law school, but really to go to Yale Law School. And I had actually mapped out a whole plan, and I had made decisions on college admissions based on that. And so what had happened, for example, was I never really got along with my high school teachers or even some of the other teachers. And my 8th grade English teacher, who I assume was an ESFJ, she didn't recommend me into the honors program for English. And I think if that had happened to an NP, they might have just gone along with it or just not really have known how to navigate it. Whereas my reaction to it was, okay, this woman's an idiot. I'm just going to ignore her and figure out how to get around it. And, and then I managed that way. And so anyway, what happens is, the NJs will often go into college or just decide at a very early stage that they're going to go to a top law school. They figure out what they have to do, and then they just do it. And when you look at a admissions process where, especially for these top schools, you need a very, very high GPA, and even a couple of bad grades here or there could really cost you any reasonable hope of getting in. NJs are prepared for that much more so than the NPs, who like to keep their options open, They're interested in a lot of different things. They don't really like to make decisions. And so by the time like it gets time to apply for law schools, the intuitive perceivers may be like entertaining law school among 14 other different options, while the intuitive judges already have things lined up. So that's kind of at the macro level. But then I think at the micro level too, when you look at, at the end of the day, these top law schools are not, they're not really making a judgment on you as a, like the totality of your life or your capability. What they're really doing is looking at your performance in a very finite period, which is, basically the 3 to 4 years that you're an undergrad, and then maybe a small amount of time after that. And so if you think about what you really need to do to get straight A's or something close to that in college, what it really comes down to is a lot of particular skill sets that really tend to favor the judgers over the perceivers. So it means showing up to class on time. It means meeting deadlines. It means organizing a lot of paperwork. It means juggling time efficiently, et cetera, which aren't necessarily reflective of one's intellectual capabilities, but they're certainly reflective of someone's ability to be organized in a conventional way. And at the end of the day, 3 or 4 years is a long time to be meeting deadlines and going through this day-to-day grind that I think is just naturally going to be easier for judgers versus perceivers to navigate. And and so I think it probably happens all the time where you have intuitive perceivers who are actually much more intelligent, more intellectually capable, who just lose out to intuitive judgers on the basis of organization and so forth. Okay, so what can intuitive perceivers do about this? Now, I mean, as I talked about in my last video, I think one thing to think about is to accept the reality of how our education system operates and to really question whether or not you even want to play in this game that's organized around a set of values and priorities that aren't really in line with your genetics and your makeup. But if you do decide that going to that you're an NP, an intuitive perceiver, and you want to go to a top law school, the question is, what can you do about it? And I think that I would offer basically 2 big lessons that you can draw here. I think the first thing is to accept that there is a minimal academic requirement that you have to meet. And I would say that, rather than fighting your genetics, your temperament, or whatever, just acknowledge it and then work around it. And so, in studying for the LSAT, for example, like figure out a plan, figure out a strategy that's going to account for your motivation and whatever, and just figure out a way to get a top score. And then in terms of your academic performance, really, first of all, if you think about this at an early enough stage, make sure to try to pick a college that's going to provide you with the flexibility and leeway and so forth to allow you to have a fulfilling academic experience. And then wherever you end up going to college, I would say that take advantage, really be strategic with your course selection, with the professors who you work for, maybe take a lot of seminars and independent studies, anything where your perceiver nature, your open-mindedness, your intellectual curiosity is going to be rewarded, rather than maybe a very rigid lecture class with a lot of deadlines and exams and so forth. And I think that it's certainly possible to do well in college, whatever your temperament is. But the other thing that I would urge you to think about is that I think technology and technological disruption is just a huge opportunity and advantage for intuitive perceivers. And I'm not ready to say that technology inherently benefits one type or the other. I think technology in general is just a liberating force that can work to the advantage of anyone with a growth mindset. But I do think, given that so much of our educational system and our society in general is oriented around judges, any kind of a disruption here, I think is going to work to the benefit of perceivers generally. And I just think that the opportunities, especially on the internet and so forth, are probably going to play to the strengths of intuitive perceivers, who are naturally more open-minded, more curious. They're willing to invest in a project out of intellectual interest, even if the payoff in the short term is not obvious. And the way that you can really take advantage of this technological disruption and then leverage it for the law school admissions game is by like applying, tailoring your admission strategy and applying at a different time. So, for example, this might mean that you take time off even before you begin college, and just take on like an interesting independent project, or take on some kind of a job or something that might, lead you to having a different narrative or different story. Or after college, just take a lot of time off. And get a job, or try to launch a venture or a business, or pursue an independent study project. Do something like that really allows you, gives you the time to show the kind of gifts that you have outside of the classroom. And the good news for intuitive perceivers is that as far as I can tell, at all these top law schools, the trend is that people in general are applying after more and more time out. Like, increasingly, people are not just applying to law school straight out of college. And so this is a trend that obviously I think can work in favor of intuitive perceivers. And so like, I'm thinking, for example, of a classmate of mine at Yale who was one of the rare ENTPs, extrovert, intuitive, thinker, perceiver. And he had a very interesting journey into law school. Like, he went to Harvard thinking he'd be a math major. Then he did reasonably well, but he realized that he wasn't just able to compete with the guys at the very top. And then he switched over to being a history major, and he thought for a while that he'd be a historian, and he did a bunch of archival research. But then he realized that the grind of archival research wasn't stimulating enough for him as an intellectual. And then he ended up working at a major consulting firm, and then he just like drew a bunch of different lessons from different things, figured out he wanted to go to law school, and he got into so so I would say that the more time you take off and the more time you give yourself before getting into the law school admissions game, that could very well be an advantageous strategy in a way that it might not be for an intuitive judger who might be very good at navigating the undergraduate and the educational process. But then when they get out of school with all the rigidity and structures, and they're left to their own devices, they may not have the creativity and curiosity and openness to really thrive in an interesting way. So if you're an intuitive perceiver in particular, I'd be very interested if this rings true, or if you agree with it, or any questions you have. And if you happen to be navigating the law school admissions process right now, and you'd like some help with the process, I do have the bandwidth right now to take on a couple of clients. I'm spending most of my time right now writing books, but I could take on a few clients. So if you, or maybe someone you know, if you're interested in working with me, definitely let me know, and I'd be happy to talk to you or talk to them. Okay, talk to you soon.